In today's video, we're going to look at hooking up an Angular front-end with an ASP.NET Core backend using JavaScript web tokens as the authentication and authorization mechanism. If you've been using the Angular or React ASP.NET Core project templates for any length of time, then you've no doubt noticed that this process has gotten a little worse with each new release since about .NET Core 3.1. Let's fix that and provide a good jumping off spot for a SaaS template or any other web project really using these technologies. Let's go. I'm going to start by creating a new project with the Angular and ASP.NET Core project template. I'm just going to use a generic name, Angular Net Core Auth Demo. The name really doesn't matter. And .NET 8 long-term support for the framework. The next thing I want to do is install some type of management tool for SQLite. If you already have one installed, feel free to use it. The best one that I've found is SQLite and SQL Server Compact Toolbox from Eric EJ. It seems to be a pretty good solution. It allows you to manage the SQLite instance just like you do in Server Explorer for SQL Server. So if you don't have one, use this one or one like it and then go through the installation process. This can be quite lengthy, so you may want to stop the video until you're done. I already have it installed, so we'll just skip right ahead. And as you can see, it gives you a tab that you can use just like you do with Server Explorer to manage SQL instances only for SQLite. It's a pretty good solution. The next thing I want to do is I want to open a command prompt and I want to cd into the application that I just created and cd into the client folder. And I just want to run npm install. This will run in the background while we're working on the C# side. Now, inside of this server project, the first thing I want to do is install a few NuGet packages. So in Browse, I'm going to look for Entity Framework Core, and we want Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. I'm on version 8.0.7, but this should work for whatever version is most recent. Then I want to install Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.tools. Next, I want to search for Entity Framework Core.SQLite and install the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.SQLite package. Next, I want to search for Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity, and I want to install Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity.Entity Framework Core. Next, I want to search for Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authentication.JWT Bearer and install that package. Okay, that should be the last one. So I want to add a new folder named code inside of the server project and add another folder inside of that named models. Inside of the models project, I want to add a new class named app user. Okay, so you can see our npm install is finished. So I'm going to close that. App user will inherit from identity user, and that requires Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity. And we want to add a couple of properties to this class: string full name and int subscription type. Next, I want to add a new class in the models project for the DB context. This will be app identity DB context. And this will inherit from identity DB context and specify app user as the generic type. Next, I'll create a default constructor, and we want to accept a DB context options, app identity DB context options. And then we'll just pass that to the base class. Now we need some app settings, so I'm going to add a new section called auth settings. And inside of this auth settings section, we're going to need a couple of values. The first one is security key. This key can be anything that you want. I'll use this as our security key, but yours can be different. The next will be a valid audience, and this will point to HTTP localhost 4200. You may recognize that as the Angular client URL. After that, we need a valid issuer. I do recommend sticking with these key names because they're kind of aligned to what JWT expects. And for this value, we need to dip into properties launch settings.json. And we want to grab the application URL, whatever port you're running on there. That URL needs to go into our valid issuer key value. Now we need to configure our application. Inside of program.cs, I need to add builder.services.add DB context, and it's going to point to our app identity DB context, and we're going to set up the options with ops.useSQLite, and the data source on that is going to be pointed to auth.db. You'll notice that auth.db doesn't exist in Solution Explorer, but it will be scaffolded when we run the migrations. Next, we need builder.services.add identity, and we want to pass an app user and identity role as the generics here. Then we need to .add any framework stores, and we need to pass app identity DB context as the generic here. Then .add default token providers. Next, we need to grab the configuration section that we added. So I'll create a new variable, authSetting equals builder.configuration.getSection. Auth settings. Whatever you named your section needs to be included here. Then we can do builder.services.add authentication, and we need to set up some options here. The first is default authentication scheme equals JWT bearer defaults.authentication scheme. The default challenge scheme is also bearer defaults authentication scheme. And the default scheme is JWT bearer defaults.authentication scheme. And then at the end of this, we need to add JWT bearer. And this also needs some options. So JWT ops. And we want to set the required HTTPS metadata equals false. We also want to save token equals true. We want to set token validation parameters equals new Microsoft.identitymodel.tokens.token validation parameters. And we need to set the issuer signing key to be a new symmetric security key. And we need to set encoding, and you may have to add a reference to system.txt, encoding.utf8.getBytes. And we're going to pass in the auth setting .getSection security key .value. We need to set validate audience to true, validate issuer signing key equals true, validate lifetime true, validate issuer true. Then we need to set the valid audience to be auth setting, and the key for that is valid audience. Also, the valid issuer needs to be auth setting valid issuer. We could finally close that one out. The next thing we need to do is set up Swagger to use that bearer authentication. Inside of add Swagger gen, we need to add some options here. We need to add security definition and pass in bearer and new Open API security scheme. And we need to configure this a little bit. The description can be whatever you want. It really doesn't matter. I'll use JWT authorization example. The name too can be pretty much anything. I'll just use authorization. N equals parameter location.header. Type equals security scheme type.api key. Scheme equals bearer. And we also need to add a security requirement. Swagger.add security requirement, new Open API security requirement. Notice the extra curly braces here. New Open API security scheme. And we need to set the reference to new Open API reference, more curly braces. And then type equals reference type dot security scheme. ID equals bearer. Then we need to pass in a scheme equals OAuth2. Name equals bearer. N equals parameter location.header. And we're going to also pass in a new list of strings. And finally, we can just add app.useAuthentication before app.useAuthorization. The next thing that needs to happen is the database migration. So inside of the Developer PowerShell tab, we're going to cd into the server folder and then run the command .NET EF migrations add. You can name it anything that you want, but I'll use initial identity migration to kind of track what we're doing. So this might take a little bit to run, but you'll notice that the migration is created for us, the migrations folder, and inside of that will be a list of the changes that needs to happen. Back in the Developer PowerShell, we'll use .NET EF database update, and this will create our AuthDB for us.
And here's your friendly reminder to like and subscribe. We post new videos often for software developers, software engineers, and software architects. Thanks.
And there it is. Now, if we go to the SQLite Explorer, the AuthDB may show up automatically for you, or you may have to add it. But if you expand the tables folder, you can see the typical ASP.NET authentication schema is there. And if we expand the ASP.NET users table, you can see the fields for full name and subscription type that we added to our app user is now listed in the table. The next thing that needs to happen is we need to add a controller to manage accounts. So I'll add a new API controller and name it Accounts Controller. I'll create a default constructor here, and we need to have as a first argument user manager, app user, and I'll just name it user manager. Then I'll create a class level variable, private read-only user manager app user underscore user manager. And then back in the constructor, I'll assign user manager to the underscore user manager. So we're going to limit this video to be only the registration process. So I'll add a new HTTP post register decorator, and that's going to correspond to /API/accounts/register. Public async task action result, and that's going to return a string and name it register. Before we get too far into this, we need some kind of object to hold the values for the registration process. So inside of the code folder, I'll add a new folder named View Models, and then add a class to that View Models folder named Register View Model. We need an email address, which is required and is a type email address. And then the type for this property is string email. And we also need a required field for full name. And we need a required field for the password. And also a required field for confirm password. So our register method is going to accept an argument of register model. Then we need to check if the model state is valid. And if it's not, we need to return a bad request, model state. Next, I'll create a new app user, and I want to pick up the email value from viewModel.email, full name. I'll set the username to be viewModel.email as well. Then we need to start the registration. Identity result equals await _ user manager dot create async user. And then pass in viewModel.password. If the result succeeded is false, we also want to return a bad request, and we'll pass back result.errors. And then finally we can return an OK. We need some kind of mechanism to pass back the result of the registration, not just the registration, but other authentication responses like the login. So I'll create a new view model, auth response view model. And this class will need a token, string token. It also needs a bool result and a string message. This will satisfy most of our use cases. So instead of passing back just an OK response, we're going to be passing back an auth response view model. The result for this will be true because we do know at this point the user has been created. The message will be account created. And since the account was created and there's no errors, we should be good to go. So now we're free to start the registration process. I'll change my window size a little bit so we can view both at the same time. First build always takes a little while longer. Okay, so first we'll see the client and then the server. And there's our register method. And click on the try it out button. And then inside of the text area, we just need to change the values. We'll use test@test.com for the email, and the full name will be test user. And then the password will be TE$T1234. I'll use the same for the confirm password, even though it doesn't matter at this point. TE$T1234. And then click the execute button. And there we go. The account was created. If we close those windows and then go back to the editor and click the stop button, let's make sure that our user was created. So inside of the AuthDB, if we look at the ASP.NET users table, there is our test user. Everything's working well. Test user, the subscription type is 0, but we don't really care about that at this point. Everything looks good. The email confirmed is 0. You'll probably want to change that to 1. We'll worry about activating users later on, but at this point, I'll call this a success. Everything seems to be working as it's supposed to. In the next video, we will hook up the login process and look at detecting whether a user is authenticated or not. Until next time, happy coding.